So during Joseph Smith's life, there were few Mormons practicing polygamy, and it was done secretly. How did that change after he died?
After he died, after Brigham Young became the leader of the church and the saints moved to Utah, they publicly acknowledged that this was a belief and a practice of the church. And that ushered in kind of a second phase and the main phase of Latter-day Saints' experience with plural marriage. And this lasted until about 1890, when President Woodruff announced the manifesto that led to the end of the practice of plural marriage.
And how many people roughly were involved?
We don't have really firm numbers that we can say a certain percentage of members were involved in plural marriage. We know it was never the majority. Even at the height of the practice, which was probably about 1860, no more than 50% of the members of the church in Utah were involved in the practice of plural marriage. That means as a husband, as a wife, as a child. Plural marriage was always controlled and authorized by the president of the church through the keys that he held. And so it was something that had to be approved through the appropriate priesthood channels. It wasn't something that anyone could just do by themselves. People were free to reject it or to accept plural marriage. Many people chose not to enter plural marriage and remained faithful members of the church.
What can we say about a typical polygamous family?
It's hard to say that there was a typical polygamous family, but statistically speaking, what we can say is that most plural families involved a husband and perhaps 2 or 3 wives at most. The very large plural families were not the norm. Some families lived all together in the same household. Others maybe lived in close proximity to each other, and some lived in completely different communities. So the living arrangements varied quite a bit.
So in historical records, it seems like some of the plural families were very happy and some of them were very difficult. So what can we say about the variety of experiences that Latter-day Saints had in plural families?
Well, you know, in some sense, just like any marriages and families, there was a lot of variation. People who practiced plural marriage were human beings just like we all are. And some did find a lot of joy, were very loving and generous and happy in their relationships. At other times, it didn't work out so well. And in those cases, and especially because leaders knew that plural marriage could be very difficult for women, there was quite a lot of leeway and provision for divorce among polygamists.
So if a woman was unhappy in a plural marriage, then she could get a divorce?
Well, yes, again, you had to go through the channels, and it was something that had to be approved, and it wasn't something that anybody did lightly.
Right.
But there was that kind of safety valve, it's been called.
Can you tell us about the experience of a particular family?
Well, one of the interesting examples that illustrates several points about polygamy during the Utah period is the family of Joseph F. Smith. He married 3 wives when he was about 30, in his early 30s, in fairly close succession to each other. And those 3 women had many children, and they all lived together in one big house. And they worked very closely together. They raised each other's children. They delivered each other's children. They cooked and cleaned and sewed and ran the household together. And in many ways, their relationship with each other was a very important part of the marriage and family relationship as a whole. They loved each other dearly. They were all very close. But later, about 20 years later, President Smith was asked to marry additional plural wives. And this was during the period when the federal government was beginning to really crack down and prosecute those who were practicing polygamy. And so he'd married these 2 younger women at that time, but they had a completely different experience. And it wasn't that the rest of the family was not willing to accept and integrate them into the family, but they were not able to be acknowledged openly. They had to go into hiding. President Smith went into hiding. It was several years before they had any children. And so their experience of plural marriage was very different than that of a couple of decades earlier. And what this shows is that it mattered when you entered into plural marriage, that the experience varied greatly over time.